Hello, and welcome back to the Infinite Restaurant Podcast, where we bring you stories from the front lines of hospitality. I'm your host, Andrew Cook. I want to reintroduce Mark Brandau. Mark Brandau is from Datassentials. He's a group manager that has been focusing on the twice-weekly COVID-19 research reports, in addition to all the firm's off-the-shelf publications. Mark, I can't thank you enough for taking this national survey and data set and reports and slicing up something specific to the Pacific Northwest. And while it's not the most data-rich sampling that we could be working with, I think that it gives us some really great access to information that we can draw some actionable conclusions. So thank you for that. And as we step into part 3, where we explore culinary appetites, is there anything that you'd like to preface this slide with, or should we just kind of jump into it?
I think we can just jump in. I think you've made the important caveat that it is a smaller sample size of people from Washington and Oregon, but still, I think that there were a few things that did jump out, and that kind of makes sense with what you know about your customers and what they know about the folks in their communities.
Okay, on this slide, I'm looking at a dude who bears a strong resemblance to Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe, but on closer inspection, he is a Muggle imposter with a hamburger. Diners will go for what they know and love, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Operators opening with limited menus should consider selections that were previous bestsellers. Interesting. That's easy to do with your POS data. So here's the question. What are you most likely going to choose from the menu the first time you go back to a dine-in restaurant? And the difference is huge. I'm looking at a pie chart here that resembles Pac-Man with lockjaw. I mean, his mouth is barely open. 89% here in the Northwest are aiming for a familiar favorite, whereas only 11% are looking for something totally new. Mark, just throw some clarity at me here just to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly. I'm looking at 11% is something totally new, which is minus 11% from general population. So is the general population in general United States at 22% looking for something totally new? Are they Pac-Man with a full mouth open?
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think one thing that's doing a lot of work here is in the question, we specify that this is the first time you go back to dine in. And, so the proposition of dine in versus delivery carryout, I think that going back to dine in, that's about reclaiming the entire experience that you have missed for a long time. And so a big part of that is, the favorite food at this restaurant that you have been missing specifically. I think that people that are using restaurants a lot in this region, if they are still, getting carry out or drive through at places that they like, that's an opportunity to kind of exercise some variety, which is important to consumers in the Northwest. But when we're talking about that first sit down meal out of the home and in a restaurant, typically you're going to plan ahead for that, and you're going to really be thinking about something specific that you want.
Exactly, and I'm saying that with benefit of knowing what's coming up on the slides, and so I'm not going to give away too much until the time is right. In fact, I'm going to, the number one culinary dish. I'm going to save that for you, Mark, because I kind of owe you. I've been taking all the really good stuff and introducing it, and then turning you over with the other things. So I'm going to save that for you. But one of those dishes that we know in advance that people are really hungry for, those flavors that they're after, involve seafood, and Pacific Rim cuisine is a big part of a lot of different culinary appetites here in the Northwest, and so we're going to be learning more about that in just a moment.
Yeah, it's hard to do it well because usually we're dealing with frozen fish, and we don't have a lot of really great fancy breadings and fryers and all that.
I'm looking at a slide now titled, "The Pacific Northwest Bucks the Trend on Health versus Indulgent. While our new normal will require continued vigilance, when it comes to restaurants, America is ready to throw caution to the wind. On their first trip back into dining rooms, people will choose indulgent dishes over healthful items. People in Washington and Oregon are far more likely to indulge." Here's the question that was asked to get these numbers. What are you most likely going to choose from the menu the first time you go back to a dine-in restaurant? Mark?
Yeah, so more than 4 in 5 people have said they want something indulgent, and only a little less than 1 in 5 people said, "Well, I'm looking for something healthful to eat." And that's even more so the case with the Northwest than it is with the rest of the country. Rest of the country, it's about two out of three people want something kind of indulgent, and I think it makes sense because what are we doing in quarantine right now but worrying about our health? I mean, we are. It's a different method. It's not necessarily what we put in our bodies. It's keeping ourselves away from potential vectors of a contagious disease. But the whole point of what we're doing right now is to safeguard our health. And once we are kind of allowed to, break quarantine and get back out into the world a little bit, um, yeah, you don't necessarily need to look for a salad or something like that. This isn't really about weight management so much as it is just about, overall holistic health. And that's what we're doing by definition right now by remaining, social distancing and staying at home.
I like how you phrase that holistic health. The comparative thoughts that come to my mind looking at this is it's kind of like when you go on a diet and you give yourself cheat days, or you start to discipline yourself in some areas and you reward yourself in others. I mean, we have been living in an imposed state of discipline for a few months now, and I think that indulging yourself is a good reward for people to have, and I think it's a pretty natural place to go. Now, help me out here. It says they're also more likely among women at 73%. What can you tell me about that?
This was for the general population. The female respondents were more likely to say indulgent than men, so more than the overall average.
Well, I guess when you put it that way, it is pretty obvious. Thank you for being kind. I generally have a very keen eye for the obvious, and this one slipped by me. So thanks for catching that, Mark. I'm going to save the reveal of this next slide for you to unpack. It was surprising for not only myself, but for a lot of people that were on the initial call that revealed it. I don't see significant differences for the Pacific Northwest as I saw nationally, except for perhaps number 3. Again, told you I was going to save stuff for you. Here's the question, and then I'll reveal the slide. The question is, what do you crave or miss the most from restaurants? Mark, what do you see?
When we ask folks what they, miss the most and the foods that they want to get back to eating, what they're really craving and missing right now, in the Northwest, a lot of these top choices are going to look like the country overall, and it's typically going to be the kinds of foods and cuisines that we know are the most loved already. We track that stuff in our flavor database of just, we present hundreds of choices to people and, tell us how much you love or like this, how often you eat it. And so a lot of these top choices of, Mexican food, Italian, pizza, those are among the most loved anyway. But in the Northwest specifically, even more than the rest of the country, people are really craving Mexican food. Almost 2/3 of people say that they are really craving Mexican food from a restaurant right now. And almost half of them say the same thing about seafood. And, that's to your point, Andy, where you mentioned before, that's an advantage that restaurateurs in Washington and Oregon can really lean into. They have a lot of really great sources of seafood around them. They have a clientele that really loves it. There are really great regional influences to draw from. So the fact that seafood is so high up here is a really great piece of news for them. And then Asian food as well. Again, we know that Asian flavors really do index a lot higher on menus in Washington and Oregon than the rest of the country. So it's just another kind of structural advantage that folks should be ready to lean into. And I'm always surprised. I always think that sushi is going to be higher on these kinds of lists, even in the Northwest. But I'm always reminded that sushi is just not as universally well liked, and a lot of people still haven't even tried it, aren't familiar with it, just in a lot of parts of the country. So I love it. I can't get enough sushi, but I'm always reminded of how in the minority I am.
And so here's kind of what starts to stand out for me looking at this graph. Up at the very top, we're seeing Mexican food at, say, 63%, seafood at 47%, Asian at 39%, Italian at 34%. But when you start to look over towards the middle and the lower end, we're looking at things like fried chicken, pancakes, frozen treats, burgers, lasagna, salads. Those are the kind of things that are pretty easy to make at home. Or a sub sandwich. I mean, I could make a sub sandwich when I was like 8 years old, but to be fair, mine was usually made up to try to replicate what I saw Shaggy and Scooby trying to eat, and it was made with everything in the fridge. So probably not. I don't think anybody ever wants to eat that. But I digress. Mark, do you feel like as we start to, I think it balances out with the other data that we've been encountering, is that when you start to reach a degree of sophistication that's hard to replicate at home, you start to hit those appetite thresholds. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, the bottom of this list is chicken nuggets, which I have gotten out of the freezer and put in the oven more times than I care to remember right now. Whereas having somebody that really knows how to cook regional Italian food, or a specific kind of Asian food, that's quite different. And especially with seafood, we've talked about it a couple times where to really execute it well, it requires a lot of time, patience, ingredients that we just probably don't have at our disposal right
Yeah, and equipment. I mean, there's some equipment that is necessary to pull some of these dishes together. And for that matter, I can't help but to start thinking about some of these signature sauces or spice rubs that restaurants have developed for their menus, and have kind of figured out the right balance of ingredients through product testing and market research and access to spices and foodstuffs that aren't on the open market. So I think a lot of that really comes down to highlighting why, say, Mexican food, which on its face seems like, well, it's not that complicated, but it kind of is. Same thing with Asian food, or proper Italian food, or even cooking a steak right. I don't see it on here, but pork chops. I mean, my mom grew up in the Midwest, and we had pork chops that was smothered in cream of mushroom soup because chances are it was going to be overcooked. But that's what makes restaurants different, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a place where meal kits have helped, quite honestly. Especially when they can pre-portion everything for you and make it easy to make a sauce or a roux or whatever you're looking for. But meal kits are probably they certainly have less traction than delivery from restaurants and carry out from restaurants.
Yeah, Mark, I'm really glad that you brought that up, that you circled back and put a little emphasis on meal kits, because I think that's an important consideration point, or important piece of context that I think we'd be doing our jobs best as in the roles that we occupy, Mark, that if we're able to remind our listeners that even though a lot of what we're talking about is the reopening of a dining room and how to make the most of it, it's not the field of dreams. Just because dining rooms are going to reopen, it doesn't mean that a lot of these innovations that we've been practicing as an industry are going to just go away. So I keep thinking of that scene from Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he trades that bag of sand for that idol at the beginning. And even though he doesn't get the weight quite right, that's sort of what we're starting to do here too. And so I urge you to don't disregard offsite dining. In fact, I say embrace it. Work on your digital storefront and start to keep on working towards the things that you wish you had developed before this happened, because there's a very real possibility that we may get a second wave of this or any major disruption. I think that if we have any takeaway from this that's not specific to the details, it is that if change is constant, that we should be getting better at it. That's the one thing that's going to be constant. That's the thing that we should be doing well, and that's changing and adapting. And so we're going to close out this episode, this part 3, that's been focusing on culinary appetites. We've been speaking with Mark Brandau from Datassentials. Thank you again, Mark. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Infinite Restaurant Podcast, where we bring you stories from the front lines of hospitality. I've been your host. My name's Andrew Cook. And coming up next, we're going to be focusing on the actual act of reopening. So stay tuned and bear in mind that Infinite Restaurants is brought to you by Harbor Food Service, where life happens around the table.